Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to Shutter Magazine. I'm Dustin Lucas and today I'm going to be talking to you about the 5 tips for better black and white editing in Lightroom Classic. So when it comes to black and white photography, of course you don't always have to shoot in black and white. Certainly helps, but we can always convert our images in post. So whenever I'm shooting in RAW, I'm always shooting in color and I'll convert my images later. But that doesn't mean I'm not thinking about contrast. I'm not thinking about my subject matter. I'm not thinking about the texture and all the details and things in the image that can really make a black and white image. And certainly those silver tones really come out. So let's go through the 5 tips. Tip number 1 is converting to with the monochromatic tool, more specifically using the black and white mix tool versus dropping saturation. I know dropping saturation is an old school way to convert your images to black and white. There's a much better way to do it. That's tip number 1. Tip number 2 is use the tone curve to dial in contrast and really explore your tonal range. We'll go through point curves using the sliders and some color grading techniques on the creativity side. Tip number 3 is use the punch tools. So there's a set of tools in the basic panel called Presence. That includes texture, clarity, and dehaze. I really like to use these 3 tools to really add some punch to my black and white images. Number 4, which is the most important tip and one of my favorite things to do, it's dodging and burning, really bringing the attention from your client, like here in this black and white image, to something like this, and really bring out those details in the image. And again, tip number 5, push creativity. I'm always stressing that in my articles, especially in Lightroom. Make virtual copies, add some warmth, some cooling effects. Here I have a little bit of a warming effect to my image, but make copies and try different things out. So let's jump into tip number 1, converting with the monochromatic tool. All right, so tip number 1 is going to be converting with the monochromatic tool. So the simplest way to do that is hit the V key. Immediately turns my image into black and white. You'll notice quite differently, it's just graying out vibrance and saturation because it's converting my image to monochromatic rather than just desaturating it. So there's a few different tools within the black and white mix, but then I want to show you the difference between desaturating your image and using the black and white mix. So I'm going to go ahead and make a copy, Command apostrophe. And so on my first image, what I'm going to do is just go ahead and click auto, and it makes the skin tones a little bit darker, which isn't necessarily what I want to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to slide this up to make it a bit brighter, and I also want to drag those blues down to really bring in some contrast in the sky. Now what's great about the black and white mix tool is there is a target adjustment tool. I talk a lot about this tool because what it does is it allows you to target very specific areas of your image to really kind of bring in some details. So we can go into different colors of the image and really drag down some of those things. Now this is a little dramatic, of course. We don't need to do anything that heavy, but we can definitely start to play around with kind of where we were. Just desaturating our image. If we put this image back in color, drop the saturation down to 0, we don't really have a whole lot of control that we can do with this, right? You're just kind of stuck with that. So just kind of seeing back and forth. Now again, this is a little heavy-handed. We don't need to do anything that crazy, but it just kind of shows you the different options you have for playing around with the black and white mix. So moving into the tip number 2, let's jump into the tone curve to start pushing the contrast of our image and exploring the tonal range. Now tone curve is definitely a powerful tool for contrast, and you'll notice that I'll use this over using tools like the contrast slider. I'm not really a fan of how that works. Of course, I do like to use the black and whites sliders just to kind of add some density to the image, but that's something I'll kind of use towards the end when thinking about output. So jumping into tone curve, There are a couple options here, right? We have sliders, which are pretty straightforward, that we can use. We have um, target adjustment tool, which I really like to use as well. So I can just kind of grab some areas, drag down to darken. I can click on her face, drag up to brighten, and so I can start to just work in different tonal ranges, to start kind of bringing those things in. But of course, we're affecting the skin tones as well as surrounding areas, so you have to be really careful when using the target adjustment tool. For me, I like to be a little more specific with it. Like I like to um, kind of matte my black tones, and then I'll come in here and just kind of bring that down a bit as well, just to kind of bring back some darker tones. Put my midpoint, my middle point back there to the middle. Kind of bring the whites down and do kind of a very similar thing with that. And so it just does a nice little subtle matte add into the clothing here. So it's nothing too crazy just yet. I mean, of course, we're going to work with the sky, kind of darkening that down, bringing some details back in the other part of the image. But overall, just kind of getting into the tone curve, I really want to start exploring some of those options. So of course, while we have that tone curve, we can also start to manipulate some of the sliders as well. So if we want to kind of do a little bit of a back and forth here, I don't think we want to go that far. We can really kind of take our image from here and just add a little bit of subtlety and some of that matting in the tone curve. So overall, we're ready to move on to the present sliders. We can bring in some clarity and some texture and really bring some punch into our image. All right, so now we're ready to add some punch to our image, which is tip number 3. So using the present sliders, I really like to zoom in to 1 to start seeing what the skin tones do, by adding some texture. So we can see that it's just adding a little bit of course, quite a bit of sharpening, but not as much toning on the face. And that's the real big difference between what clarity does and what texture does. I feel like texture is much more about sharpening the edges and less adjusting that mid-tone contrast. But it all just kind of depends on your um, specifically what you like to use. What's great about these 3 sliders is they're also included with your adjustment brushes. So you've got texture, clarity, dehaze also available. So I feel like it's a really good way to kind of add a little bit of punch to the image overall. But if you want to start messing with the sky separate from the skin tones, that's something where you can really explore softening the skin, um, which usually, softening the skin, you'd use negative clarity, but I find that using negative texture does a little bit better of a job overall. So I can soften the skin a little bit as well. So it's definitely a feature that I like to use and bring some sharpening back into it. So we can definitely save skin softening for some local adjustments that we'll do later in the dodge and burn. But overall, I mean, with kind of bringing in some texture and some different details, we can take a look at this image, zoom out here, and use you know adjustment brush here if we wanted to explore adding some texture, maybe even a little bit of clarity and some dehaze. If we wanted to just start painting that into the sky specifically, we can see all that detail that starts to come back, right? So, and maybe even into some of the amusement park area here. So, um, what I really like about that is we can then kind of dial some of this back. We don't need as much clarity. We can add some more dehaze. Really bring that sky out. Sky starting to get a little crazy overall, but we can also drop. Well, don't want to drop the whites down too much there, but we have some, of course, different options as well. But yeah, that really works out for the adjustment brush and kind of painting that in. And of course, we'd want to bring that around them. We can add some some real nice texture into the boardwalk and things like that. Just to kind of real quick show those adjustments quite a bit with just doing some of that texture work there. So I'm going to go ahead and just reset that. We don't need that for now. Let's move into the dodging and burning part, which I really like using the radial tool, and then refining my mask with the erase brush. So let's jump into that. All right, so what I like to do for dodging and burning is use the radial filter. So if I hold shift and click the M key, it immediately pulls up the radial filter. Now, this tool is one of my favorite tools because of how fast it works. Like for instance, if I want to draw over top of my main subjects here, I have a couple options, right? I can hold shift and that will increase everything the same size. I can just click to make it wider. I can also hold option and drag this side. So those are the three kind of features of how the radial filter works, along with hitting the O key to see um, to see where the effect is going to go. So right now the effect is going to go on them. Let me just show off how this works. So of course, right, we want the invert to be turned off, and this is basically how the tool works. Now, clearly that's terrible way of doing, um, kind of dodging and burning, at least to start out. But getting our feather, we can increase the feather to have it go in or decrease to have it go out. Now, of course, that just looks really bad, and haloing is a big no-no when it comes to editing. But just to do something quick, you can see how quickly we can kind of, if we want to come in and add some texture, a little bit of clarity, and just really boost the dehaze, we can do that quite quickly. Now, of course, it's being applied on them, so this is where we can zoom in and refine our mask, which is very, very important during this process. So let's zoom in here, and we will use the brush. We can just come in here and paint it off of the subject. So of course I'm holding option to get that brush to pop up, and then just painting on them. Now I have auto mask turned on, so if I hit the O key, you can kind of see where our mask is being turned off. And if I follow the edge of her arm, it'll do a pretty good job of keeping them. If I want to bring in around them, it actually did a pretty good job of not going too much on their legs. And that's kind of how I'll do a rough mask here. Now you have to keep in mind if some areas aren't being removed, it's because you have auto mask turned on. So if they're not going away, I would suggest, now what I would do is come in here and kind of paint over their faces again because there's some missing areas, and then come back with the erase tool. Now of course this is pretty tedious and it's all about details here, so if you're not as worried about the little details and getting between their legs and things like that, you don't have to do this, but I like to be a little more precise on my mask. But that's not too bad for, a minute, 30 seconds or so working with this. So this gets us to where they've been completely masked out. And what I like about this is that now that I've done this mask for them, excuse me, if I think about it like this, the pink part is where, or the red part's going to be where the effect is being applied. So it's not necessarily a mask, but it's more showing where the overlay, where the effect is going to go. So wherever the normal color is, the effect is not being applied. So if we do want to apply the same mask to them, but we don't have to repaint it, I love this trick. So I like to right click on the pen, choose duplicate, and what I'll do is I'll just drag it slightly to the right. so that way I can kind of choose between the two pins. And so if I want to go back and forth, I can, right? So here's why I do that. So once I do that, I can then come in here and I can go back to edit and I can invert this mask. Now, of course, let's see here. This didn't work out nearly as well as I had hoped. Let's see here. So if I have my mask set up like that, let's pick the first pin. Maybe it'll do a better job of inverting. Well, it's not doing exactly what I wanted it to do. Let's see here. Why it's not working as well as it typically does. Let's try it again. Let's see, invert. Maybe it's not going to be as work as well for me. We'll go in here to do brush. Come in and just quickly, we'll just come in here and paint it out. It is what it is. Doesn't always work, of course, as seamless as that was shown, probably because I was erasing out more of the brush. So once we get this kind of cleaned up, we can get back to what we need to. So got some a little bit of over paint here that we can get out. And I will say that the auto mask does a pretty good job overall here. It's not perfect by any means, but it does a good job. So we want to make sure the all areas of them. So that's pretty quick. We can turn off the filter there. We don't want to do dehaze. We'll turn that stuff off. We don't need the exposure that high. But we can jump in here to see kind of the difference in doing this pretty quickly. Now we can add a little bit of texture to them. And we can lower the blacks a bit. Increase the exposure. I think I can add a little sharpness for them. Just to kind of bounce in. And what I'll do too is come in here and do an adjustment brush and come in here and want to do a little bit of skin softening. I can. Pretty subtle. Bring back some sharpness, of course. I think that that looks fine. Of course, if I wanted to do new brush, add a little bit of brightness to the face. That might be a little much. Yeah. Get rid of that altogether. So the dodge and burn technique is something you want to be pretty subtle with. Overall, I don't necessarily need to go that dark with it, but we can even kind of flatten that out if we want to kind of calm all of that down. So I mean, I feel like the dodge and burn is a very specific of highlighting the client, darkening the background. We can come in here and do a little bit more work on, darkening some of these areas with just an adjustment brush. That's a little crazy. Just kind of bringing that down, and we can add a little bit of sharpness there just to kind of help. I think that might be a little much, but as well as with the dodge and burn, we did the skin softening, and refining the mask. I think that um, the graduated filter can also be a nice tool to use, especially for the sky. So if I'm holding shift and kind of keeping my, let's see here, back to the graduated filter, and just kind of drag it from the top. It's one where we can really bring in the sky. Now, of course, our clients here are being affected, so we would want to come in with a brush in the same way, and we would paint them out with auto mask turned on. I really like using auto mask. Of course, to get that off of their faces. We don't need that on there. We could turn our mask on just to kind of see where they're being painted. I feel like that really helps hitting the O key so you can see where your mask is so you don't leave any areas. That's always kind of a pain. This works out pretty well too. Just doing a quick removal, nothing too crazy, but we can kind of see bringing that sky in really kind of makes the image intense. I mean, might be a little over the top for sure. So we can dial back the dehaze a little bit here. But definitely adding some clarity and some texture helps as well. So if you just want to do the sky or want to do the ground separate from them, you can. It's all about the direction that you're dragging that up as well. But we're definitely ready to move on to the, let me go back here a couple steps. Reset that, turn my radio filters back on. But we're definitely good to move on to the creative part where we can start doing some color grading and things like that. All right, now we're ready for tip number 5, and that's push your creativity, right? So it's kind of a multifaceted tip because it's always good to make virtual copies and to always kind of push different looks and creative effects and things like that on your image. So when you're done with the dodge and burn, which I'm pretty happy with this. It's kind of looking a little bit funky and gray here in the middle, but overall, I'm going to kind of leave this image as is, and I'm going to start messing with the split toning and some color grading. So I really like to start by making one virtual copy and going into the tone curve, and more specifically I can go into the point tone curve and go to the blue channel, and so I can lift this up to cool the image down quite quickly or drag it to warm the image up in the shadows. And I can also start to mess with how the highlights look. So if I want to cool down the highlights to counter that warmth, add even more warmth, I can. But there's kind of a cool effect that you can do with your images while it's you have your matte effect being applied. Of course, this isn't affecting that. But if I need to reset this only, this is something to keep in mind, because if I reset my entire tone curve, I'll lose everything. But if I don't like this warming effect, I can just flatten the blues. But you can see how that kind of goes back to almost like a cooler look. So I like that a little bit of warmth, I think, goes a long way. Kind of bring it right into there. We can just kind of see, well, really kind of here to there, just a little bit of warmth, nothing too crazy. This kind of shows a little bit more. So this is before the effect. Let's see. Let's see which of my images here we're looking at. So we're there. Yeah. Big difference between, well, not a real huge difference, but just a little bit of warmth, right, between the left and the right. Now, of course, I can take this a step further, make a virtual copy of that, go back in the develop module and reset this and go to a different one. I can go to red if I want to add a little bit of cyan, or I can add a little bit of red to the image. Yeah, it doesn't really do much for me. Go ahead and flatten that. Maybe what I want to do is take this down to the split toning panel, and I can choose highlights to be cooler, and I can decrease my saturation, and I can choose the shadows to be warmer. Do something kind of very much in the name, kind of more split toning. Not sure if I really like the cool effect, but with the shadows I can play a little bit more with the warmth. Of course, I can tone it any which way I want. I mean, could do something like a cyanotype, kind of more blue tone there. That's kind of cool. But yeah, there's definitely multiple ways that you can do. I like the I don't like the split toning as much as I like to use the curves, but we can kind of explore that a little bit more and kind of just give a little more subtlety to the image overall. So I think that's about where I'd have the final image, and I can just kind of show some different options here, especially ones I'd want to do different options for the client. So pushing that creativity, of course you're wanting to come in and add maybe even a little more matte to that. We can do that on this copy, simply because we have the ability to come in here to the tone curve. If I want to get even more wild with that matte look, like a nice matte, that back. Can really kind of toggle the difference between there and there. And if I feel like everything is good to go. We're ready to print, and I think that's where I'll land on my warmer edit, and that's the 5 tips. All right, so there you have it. Those are the results, and these are the 5 tips for better black and white. So let's go through them again. Tip number 1, convert using the monochromatic tool or black and white mix. I highly recommend that versus desaturating your image. Um, Tip number 2, use the tone curve. From contrast to exploring your tonal range, you can even do some warming and more color grading effects with it. So the tone curve is a very valuable tool and really powerful. Tip number 3 is going to be using the presence sliders. Texture, clarity, dehaze. These are some really cool, um, tools. As you can see in the sky and the image overall, just got so much more sharp and a lot more contrast and things like that. I've really pulled this image together and kind of taken it from its color shot here on the left, which looks fine, but really kind of gives it a lot more impact in the black and white. I really like the way this black and white edit turned out. And of course, tip number 4, dodging and burning. That's really where you can focus on your main subject and really lead the viewer's eye to get to the main subjects, especially with all this really cool, and leading lines and detail and things like that in the background. There's signage and roller coasters and just this, um, you know, uh, boardwalk that goes all the way back, what looks like to the horizon line. It's really cool image overall, but I feel like the dodging and burning really helps get me to the viewer, which is such an important part. Tip number 5, which is going to be pushing your creativity. So taking all of these things in mind, making copies, pushing the images. Of course, that's going to give you different options to your client, and certainly, you might decide you like something with a warming effect or something with a little less subtle, a little more subtlety on the dodge and burn side, so the image isn't so heavily edited, of course. But end of the day, um, you know, push yourself to work faster in Lightroom, and ultimately, don't limit yourself to one look. And yeah, tune into next month where I have more articles on the newest update on Lightroom 9.3 that came out for Lightroom Classic. A lot of changes happening, and we'll be exploring that next month.